Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. Our guest this week is Dr. Mark Kotter. Mark is a neurosurgeon, stem cell biologist, and founder or co-founder of 3 biotech startup companies that have collectively raised hundreds of millions of pounds: bit.bio, clock.bio, and Meatable. In addition, Mark still conducts neurosurgeries on patients weekly at the University of Cambridge. We'll talk to Mark about all his companies, but we'll start by discussing Meatable, one of the leading companies in the cultured meat sector. This is an area of technology which should have a far greater impact than most people are aware of, and it's an area we haven't covered before in the podcast. So Mark, thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Mark.
So Mark, let's start with your own background. What was your journey into neurosurgery, stem cell biology, and the world of startups?
That takes me back to school years, where probably my only talent was maths, and I had really no inclination to enter medicine or biology. But starting with maths at university, I realized that I wasn't able to understand how I could apply it in a practical way and how I could make a difference to the world. Probably quite naive at that moment in time, but I decided to look for something else that had more tangible benefits and came up with medicine. I couldn't trust myself that this was the right choice. So I decided to try it out and worked as a healthcare assistant or a nurse assistant for 6 months. And then at the end of that decided, yes, I'm going to pivot to medicine. During my studies there, always the question of how does it actually work came up. So I was quite drawn to research from an early stage, and then had the fantastic opportunity to work in Cambridge and then do a master's and a PhD in Cambridge, which set me on the path of regenerative medicine. And this is, of course, where stem cells play a role as well. How do I combine this with my medical interests? I was very interested in the brain and the spinal cord. As a nurse assistant, I was working mainly with spinal cord injury patients, and somehow that caught up with me at a later stage, so I decided neurosurgery would be a good path for me, especially looking after spinal cord injury patients. And then I tried to combine research and neurosurgery and ended up at Cambridge starting my lab, which was the beginning of the transition to all the other ventures.
You mentioned stem cells there, Mark. It's a field that's had a lot of excitement for a lot of time, but many people are a bit disappointed at how little stem cells can be used in practice. Do you share that assessment? Do you see stem cells as still something that's going to be huge, but not yet?
I must agree with your assessment. There was a fantastic article in the MIT Tech Review last year, which asked the question, after 25 years of stem cell research, they're still waiting for their moment. What we've learned over the last 25 years is that we can generate stem cells, we can even turn skin cells back into stem cells, but we really struggle to turn them into the cell types that actually make a difference. For example, for diabetes, you don't need a stem cell, you need a pancreatic islet, which produces insulin. And that transition from a stem cell to the various different cell types that can make a difference, that is extremely complex. People have been working on a paradigm that is based on developmental biology, trying to understand what happens when an embryo emerges. And there are some biological problems with that. Firstly, it takes long. It takes 9 months until we're born. Some of these cell protocols require months. Secondly, in development, it is important that all the cells of the body are created. Think about it. If we would forget to do skin cells or brain cells, that would lead to a major birth defect. Nature uses stochastic principles, i.e., cells actually roll the dice as to which cells they should become. And the ratio of cells is determined so that it actually creates all these riches of cells. But if you combine long protocols and stochastic steps, then you get to a manufacturing paradigm that is very irreproducible, so very difficult to scale. And that's really where we're stuck. Now, the good news is that there's another way of looking at biology. You could say a synthetic biology approach or programming approach, which actually can be traced back to the 1980s, received a Nobel Prize in 2012 for the induction of pluripotent stem cells and can be generalized. And that shortens the timeline by a factor of 10, and it can make it very robust. So in a nutshell, I would say we had huge struggles with the old paradigm, and the new paradigm is just being explored. And I do think that is the answer to these bottlenecks that have really restricted the use case.
Turning to the world of cultured meat, otherwise known as the lab-grown meat industry, some people are drawn to this industry by concerns about global warming, other people by concerns about animal welfare. What was your motivation for getting into the field?
First of all, I didn't know much about it as a neurosurgeon. I just had this protocol that very efficiently can turn stem cells into muscle cells, which is one important component of meat. And at a conference, I showcased the technology, and someone said, hey, this could be really something that the cultured meat field is looking for. And they made a connection to someone who is now one of the co-founders of Meatable. So I got on a call. I was just looking, frankly, for funding at that moment in time as a junior PI. And we had this conversation. And in my mind, I thought, well, this is a bit yucky, this cultured meat. But then he just explained what the context is, the climate-relevant gases that are produced, methane, etc., how important the impact of antibiotics is. A lot of industrial farming relies heavily on antibiotics, which is a problem for a clinician because, of course, it creates resistances. Then we've seen how a high-intensity farming can cause pathogens to jump from animals to human beings, and it might even be the case also for the recent COVID crisis. So there's another reason why perhaps we want to rethink this. And personally, I've been in a journey where I had episodes where I was more focused on vegetarian food rather than meat. I do eat meat, not much. I like it if it's organic. And so all of that made sense and swayed me to join their ambitions. Ultimately, that led to the setup of Meatable.
And for those of our audience who aren't familiar with the cultured meat industry, how does it work? How do you grow meat in a laboratory?
I think the best way of thinking about it is what is meat? Ask the question, what is meat? And it's really a tissue that is composed of muscle and fat. And in theory, if you reproduce that tissue, then you should have meat that you can consume. Interestingly now, after 5 years of working on this, I was able to actually taste the outputs. And I can tell you that I was really unbelievably surprised of what Meatable had been able to create by combining the muscles and the fat cells that they produce from a porcine background. In fact, a fully synthetic product is really undistinguishable from real pork. It has the battery notes that you associate with pork. That convinced me that actually this is something that can be produced. Now, the problem, of course, is the costs at the moment are still relatively high. Meatable was able to reduce them already by a factor of 10. And the question of who would be the audience that buys into that new paradigm of cultured meat.
What is the cost gap? How much more expensive is Meatable's pork than farm-grown pork?
It's a moving target because as they go from larger to very large bioreactors and continue with their process development, the price drops. The last board meeting I remember, they showed that they reduced the price already by a few orders of magnitude. And I believe they have a path to getting to what's called price parity, which essentially means that you can produce cultured meat in bioreactors for the same or less price than farmed meat. The timelines to that depend on funding, but it's possible to get there within the next 24 months or so. which I feel is really quite extraordinary.
When the cell culture grows, what is the fuel that you're supplying to make it grow? Because I've heard people complain that actually animal product needs to be put into the brew to make the cells grow in number. And so it's not really animal-free at all.
I think that is a little bit of a hoax. Fundamentally, cells require sugar, energy essentially, and amino acids. And then they can use that to assemble and grow. There's some issues with particular processes that don't follow the synthetic biology paradigm that I'm very interested in. They are using precursor cells that they have to actually take out from animals, and they have to recurrently go there and get them, or they have to use those and then transform them into some sort of cancer cell line that perpetually grows. That is one constraint that some companies face. And the second is that some of these cells require culture medium that includes fetal bovine serum, which of course totally defeats the purpose. If you actually require animal products to grow your cells, then maybe you can achieve an amplification, but it's not really the purest view of the world. Now, as far as Meatable is concerned, they don't need any of those animal products. It's really just the basic components which you can get from algae or even plants, etc. So I can assure you that Meatable does not rely on any animal products.
So is Meatable a lab-grown meat company, or is it a plant-based meat company? My understanding is those are two different things.
Meatable is a cultured meat company, so they actually have a single origin cell, which is then modified, which provides the manufacturing basis of all the meat that they produce. So at the beginning, either they need to take a blood draw or they use an embryonic stem cell, and then they can create their entire manufacturing platform based on that. At some point, they actually had that slogan saying one cell to feed the world, because it's extraordinary. These pluripotent stem cells can divide perpetually. That means that it's actually thinkable that all your meat production, and I'm thinking tons, can be done by a single starting cell.
Yeah, that is amazing. And you talk about bioreactors. What are bioreactors? And in fact, what does a cultured meat plant look like on the inside?
A bioreactor is essentially a vessel, often a stainless steel vessel, that comes at different sizes, up to 20,000 liter plus, where the nutrients and the media are infused in a controlled way and exchanged. Often they also have devices that stir the media in the reactor. Sometimes it's propellers. Sometimes they use bubbles where they infuse oxygen to sort of stir the tank. And that growth media supports the cells to grow. That's in a nutshell a bioreactor. It's a large tissue culture device. And then you can have specialized bioreactors that enable you to even create tissues. So you can align muscle tissues so that they form something that looks like a real muscle and actually can contract. So bioreactors are also vessels that can help to provide structure to cells. The concept is they maintain and feed cells and allow them to be healthy.
I think it's fair to say that the alternative proteins or alternative meat industry doesn't impinge much on the consciousness of the wider public. But there is a surprising number of companies already operating in the sector. In his rather cleverly named book, Moore's Law, which is a pun on Moore's Law, obviously, Jim Mellon lists over 150 of these companies. Why do you think that such an important industry has got such a low profile?
You rightly segmented this into alternative proteins, which are often plant-based, soya bean paste, etc. They have had quite a run. They are already in the supermarkets and McDonald's, etc. But you get the sense that it tastes similar, but it's not meat. And then one question that one needs to ask is, how healthy is this? It's very processed, and we're learning more and more about how processed food impacts on us. So I think it's a great solution for people who want something like meat but don't want meat as such, and it's already available. On the other hand, cultured meat tries to create the real stuff, which essentially is indistinguishable. And I now believe it's possible. Pricing is still a big problem. People are working on it, and it takes big investments to bring the price down, and it's been a tough environment for investment recently. Now, you can also imagine as a transition products that are combining both things. They might use plant proteins and cultured fat. I've tried that as well, products that are combined products. The advantage is that the costs are easier to bring down because you only need to grow one cell type. The interesting thing is that the taste of meat is mainly contained in fat cells. So when you try these hybrid products, and I can only speak about those that Meatable was able to produce so far, it's nearly there. So it's a real step up from the plant-based products that you have in terms of tasting like meat. I would say maybe 95, 97% like the real thing in terms of the taste. But there's still a difference to the full synthetic meat, which is muscles and fat.
Yeah. I had an Impossible Burger a couple of years ago. I don't often go into McDonald's. In fact, I never go into McDonald's, so I've not tried one since. And it was very good. But as you say, it was kind of about 90% of the way towards meat. So you're hoping that maybe with sufficient funding, you can get to price parity in a couple of years. What do you think will happen then? Do you think that there will be a rapid uptake, or do you think it will carry on being quite a slow process?
That depends entirely, I think, on your go-to-market strategy. What we do know is that the population is quite receptive. I wouldn't say everyone, but young people more than older people. People that have issues with the ethics around animals, of course, are much more motivated than those who don't. And actually, those that are aware of the climate impact, meat is about 15% of greenhouse gases, so that's quite substantial. It's probably the largest single contributor, actually. Also are highly motivated. And then put that into the context. I think the meat market as such is gigantic. So in order to build a very large company, you need just a tiny sliver. And actually, you wouldn't probably be able for years to deal with the demand that exists. So I would say from an economic perspective, there's every reason to believe that these companies, once they solve the price issue, are going to take off.
You've mentioned meat, but of course there are many kinds of meat.
Yeah.
There's fish, there's fowl, there's pork, there's cows. Is the same technique applicable in each case, that you get one cell and magnify it? Or are some of these types of meat more likely to reach tipping point in the market sooner than others?
We know about Meatable's technology that it's transferable between species. That is probably not the case for other approaches. So this is quite unique, I would say, to the Meatable platform. The reason why Meatable has chosen pork is because it was the easiest cell to handle, and there's this huge demand on pork. You have complications with pathogens in swine flu, etc. So people felt that's the first horse to bet on, so to speak. But of course, they have been doing skunk works, and they have other species, bovine, etc., in the making.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
If you're an engineer, you're a scientist, you love Formula One, you love cycling, you love learning about how new technologies are changing the world around us, then I thought you may want to listen into my new podcast, the Neil Ashton Podcast. We talk to leading engineers and scientists from around the world hear about their life stories, hear about new technologies, and hopefully educate you and give you a better sense of how key things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, supercomputing are changing the world around us. If that sounds like it's something you might like, you should come and have a listen.
On the health front, many people will still be worried that somehow there's some processing going on which will make it unhealthy. And of course, the word processed means many different things. Are you able to say what is it about the processing of food that makes it so unhealthy, and therefore what you're doing in Meatable doesn't have anything to do with that?
As far as I understand, processing starts with chopping things, blending, for example. That's already has very severe impact on how healthy, for example, oranges are. If you eat oranges, they're healthy things. If you drink that juice, it's basically sugar water that you're drinking, and most of the health benefits are gone. Some of the processing leads to breaking of sugars, and those sugars then become more easily released and taken up by the body, and that creates stress, metabolic stress that then can lead all the way to diabetes. I believe that probably other nutrients that are cut up and have a different release profile also can add to the unhealthiness of processed food. And then, of course, if you think about how some of the food ingredients are produced, they really separate these out into base components, amino acids, for example, or fat, that are then chemically engineered to create everything from margarine to the paste that is used for plant-based burgers or protein bars. I'm really not a nutrition expert, but my understanding is that our gut and the bacterial colonies in our gut are fine-tuned to dealing with natural foods, and that processing can have quite severe impact on how healthy food is. Now, if you think about what Meatable does, it creates cells. And these cells are, as I said, pretty much the same as they are in the real animal. At this point in time, I would consider them like mints. They're aggregates together. I haven't seen studies that compare meat and minced meat in terms of their health impact. But I imagine that there's probably not a huge difference. Overall, one needs to obviously be mindful that eating large amounts of meat is not a healthy thing, and that your diet needs to be balanced. Another thing that you can do if you engineer meat in bioreactors is you can fine-tune it in such a way that certain fatty acids are no longer there, which are unhealthy, and you can tune up some that are thought to be more healthy. So there is a whole universe to be explored, and we'll have to just see. Obviously, before you enter into the market, quite rigorous testing has to be done in order to ensure that the food is healthy and acceptable for a regulator.
That's a very interesting point. Presumably, it won't be quite as long drawn out a series of tests as drugs have to go through, whether you've got clinical phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, and it can take well over a decade to get through them. It won't have that delay, will it?
I don't think so, but I think the manufacturing regulation is pretty similar to clinical, not far off. And then the health assessments, they have to show certain things. But I mean, I'm really not an expert in that. We would have to ask someone who knows more about that.
So the potential impacts of the alternative proteins industry are really quite extraordinary. I mean, at the moment, humans raise and kill billions of animals every year to feed ourselves. That's not terribly healthy for us, and it's obviously not terribly healthy for them. And we also use an enormous amount of land for the purpose.
Yeah.
We're used to thinking of the UK as being a small, densely packed island. But actually, if you fly over it, even if you fly over the southeast of England, it's all green. And it's being used to grow crops for human consumption and for animal consumption to feed humans. I've read that 70% of the UK's landmass is used for growing crops for feeding animals or for grazing animals directly on. And the same amount of land again abroad is also used to create food for people in Britain. Conceivably, if and when alternative proteins take over the meat industry, that land will become available for something else, which could be a really quite extraordinary event. It's fascinating how these technologies, many of them will have really remarkable knock-on impacts.
I've seen some statistics around the biomass of animals, livestock versus wild animals. It's really mind-blowing. Wild animals are a small sliver of what lives on this planet. And I think that's concerning. I also agree that it would be nice if we would be able to rewild some of the pastures. It's a very delicate thing, of course. You've got farmers. They have been serving us for centuries. One needs to be mindful of what their role might be. And I think they could be guardians of wildlife and forests. There's a lot of demand on wood. Britain had large forests. So I think you can think about slowly changing that over time. The thing that for me makes a lot of sense is these industrial food plants where chicken are in arrays and intelligent animals like pigs are housed in really terrible circumstances. I think if cultured meat would be able to solve some of those constraints, it would be a good thing. I just can't believe that it'll take over every meat production. I don't think that's possible. People might be driven towards more organic forms of farming. I don't see a world where that doesn't exist anymore.
Yes, although I suppose the economics might militate against that, because obviously you're on a downward price trajectory. And the first thing you're going to hit is organic farming. And the last bastion of meat that will hold out will be the very cheap stuff where the animals are being really mistreated. It will take quite a while. These things always take longer than you think.
I would say that there's only a marginal difference between organic meat and industrial meat if you think about where the current price of cultured meat is. So we're orders of magnitude out. And here's nuance, really. So if and when that technology matures and it reaches price parity, I do believe that that will make a big difference. Whether something costs 1.5 times or twice as much, if you really reach price parity, I don't think that makes a difference.
But presumably your cost-saving process won't stop at parity. You should be able to drive the cost down considerably below normally raised animals.
There are some boundary constraints that you need to solve for, but there are actually models where you can use light photosynthesis to create the components, the amino acids, the sugars that you require for the broth, and then solar power to drive the electricity to drive the biomanufacturing process. And then you end up with extremely low cost of goods. So yes, theoretically, you can probably continue on that trajectory of price reduction.
That's by using multiple kinds of technology. It's usually the way. The most interesting products and services don't just ride one innovation curve. They bring in ideas from several different places.
Yes, exactly.
And that leads me to ask you a bit more about the wider implications of some of your cell technologies. We've focused so far on how we can create from stem cells different kinds of meat cells or muscle cells or fat cells. What are the other broader uses that you're looking at in some of your other work?
I'm a doctor, so my primary focus is trying to see whether we can create new therapeutics, new therapies for patients. I'm really driven by my personal experience with the patients that suffer from spinal cord injuries, although that is probably one of the hardest problems to tackle. I'm excited about bit.bio, who have really built a platform that can recreate any human cell type and manufacture it with consistency and at scale. And the promise here, of course, is extraordinary. You could create cell therapies that replace lost liver cells, which is the first ambition that bit.bio has formulated, hoping to get into the clinic end 25, beginning 26. You can think about neurological conditions, for example, epilepsy or Parkinson's, that can be treated. There's been some really exciting data that a collaborator of ours called Blue Rock Therapeutics, which is the Bayer company, has published recently, showing that the cells survive long-term and that the dose of the cells has an impact on the movement disorder of Parkinson's. And then, of course, if you think about diabetes, insulin-producing cells have been transplanted into patients with type 1 diabetes, and those have been cured. They no longer require external insulin pumps, which is a game changer for the patients, but also a game changer for the health of the patients. We're just seeing the beginning. I think the big dream of regenerative medicine is coming true now. It'll take some time until people realize that. There's always a bit of a lag. But the hopes that we had 10, 15 years ago, I think, are beginning to crystallize.
When you got new brain cells, neurons, or whatever other brain cells that might help with Parkinson's, how do you persuade the brain to incorporate them? Because the brain generally doesn't generate too many new neurons, as I understand. And I can understand how you could add cells to a liver or add cells even to the parts of the body that deal with diabetes. But can this be done in the brain as well?
You bring up a very important point. I think solving the architecture of a brain, which means essentially putting cells in the right location and then making sure that they connect with cells in distinct parts of the brain, will be super difficult. So the focus at this point in time needs to be localized conditions. For example, we know that in Parkinson's, a particular class of neurons is being destroyed in a particular location. And studies, preclinical and now even human studies, have shown if you can inject dopaminergic neurons into that exact location, they actually can have an impact. Similarly, with epilepsy, if you inject inhibitory neurons that dampen the focal point where these epileptic waves are generated, then you can again have profound impact. So it seems like you can deliver cells into the brain. They will integrate locally, but of course, the long distance integration that you, for example, would also need for a spinal cord injury is still a way to go and technically very challenging.
What about motor neuron disease? Just as another example where nerve cells of one sort stop working. Is there a possibility that your techniques might help people who are on the downward spiral of MND?
So there have been cell transplants in the context of motor neuron disease by a colleague, actually a British colleague, at Cedars-Sinai. This is a large hospital network in the US. And instead of transplanting neurons, the idea was to transplant cells that can support the existing neurons and help them not become sick and die. And I believe there are some signals that that could be possible. What I'm trying to say is we might not have to be literal. We need to think about what cells could make a difference. And sometimes it's not a direct replacement. It is a support function that changes the environment so that the cells that you want to save actually survive. So there's a huge amount of things that can be explored.
Well, Mark, it's an absolutely fascinating area of science that you're working in. There are so many interesting avenues to explore in technology, and this is certainly going to be one of the most impactful. So thank you very much indeed for joining us on the London Futurists podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Thank you.
People can find out more about your work from bit.bio and from Meatable. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this show, consider giving us a good rating and telling your friends about it as well. Thanks, everybody.